The mid-June heat of Texas pressed down like a weight that summer of 1945, thick and unrelenting, the kind that made men dream of shade and cold water. Behind the wire at Camp Swift, somewhere between Austin and Houston in that endless sprawl of prairie and scrub, thousands of German soldiers sat in their barracks or walked the dusty compounds, trying to make sense of their new reality. They had arrived expecting punishment, maybe even death. The propaganda ministers back home had painted vivid pictures of American savagery, of prisoners worked to death in mines, of starvation rations, of brutality that would make the harshest Wehrmacht discipline seem gentle by comparison. Instead, the air that drifted through the camp carried scents that seemed impossible, hickory smoke curling up from cooking pits, the rich smell of beef fat sizzling over coals, the sweet aroma of baking bread that made stomachs growl, and memories stir of homes that now lay in ruins across the ocean. Young boys ran past the fencing with ice cream cones melting in their hands, laughing in the careless way that only children in peacetime can laugh. Women in summer dresses carried baskets of food toward long tables being set up beyond the wire. American soldiers moved with an ease that seemed almost careless, joking with each other, carrying trays laden with more food than these prisoners had seen in months, maybe years. Glass bottles of Coca-Cola clinked together in wooden crates, condensation beading on their sides in the heat. For men who had been raised on the pronouncements of the Reich, who had been told again and again that democracy meant weakness, that America was a nation of soft, decadent people barely able to feed themselves, this abundance felt like a hallucination. How could a country at war, fighting on two fronts across two oceans, treat its enemies not just fairly, but generously? How could they have so much to spare? The journey that brought these men to this strange moment had begun more than 2 years earlier, in the desert wastes of North Africa, where sand and heat had become their constant companions. The Afrika Korps had fought hard under Rommel's command, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance and stubborn resilience. But tactics could not conjure fuel from empty tanks, and brilliance could not make ammunition appear when supply convoys burned under Allied air attacks. By May of 1943, the situation had become untenable. Squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army pushing from the east and American forces driving from the west, with the Mediterranean at their backs and no hope of evacuation, 250,000 Axis troops found themselves with no choice but surrender. The news shocked the world. Such a massive capitulation seemed to signal something fundamental about the direction of the war, a turning point that could not be ignored or explained away. The prisoners expected harsh treatment in those first hours after laying down their weapons. Stories circulated among them of Soviet brutality, of men marched into captivity and never seen again. Even the Western Allies might reasonably seek revenge for years of warfare, for cities bombed, for soldiers killed. Instead, they received water, medical attention, and processing that seemed almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. They were loaded onto trucks that carried them to ports, to ships waiting in harbors that bustled with activity. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks, cramped and uncomfortable in the holds of Liberty ships, those mass-produced cargo vessels that America was building at a pace that seemed to defy logic. One vessel every 3 days, the rumor went, and looking at the convoys stretching to the horizon, it seemed plausible. In the dim holds, surrounded by the smell of salt water and diesel fuel, the sounds of men breathing and shifting in their sleep, guards brought food down on metal trays. White bread, actual butter, portions of meat that would have seemed generous even in peacetime Germany. One soldier from Bremen scratched in his diary with a pencil stub that the voyage across the ocean, despite its discomforts, fed him better than his last 6 months on the front. Norfolk, Virginia became their first glimpse of America, and that glimpse shook foundations. The harbor stretched impossibly large, filled with ships of every description. Cargo vessels, tankers, warships at anchor, small boats cutting white wakes through the grey water. Cranes towered overhead, lifting containers with mechanical precision. Warehouses lined the waterfront, their doors open to reveal stacks of crates and barrels that seemed to go on forever. Railroad tracks curved away into the distance, where locomotives sat breathing steam, ready to haul their loads into the continental interior. Most striking of all was what the prisoners did not see. No bomb damage, no rubble, no burned-out buildings or hastily patched walls. The city stood intact, functioning, prosperous in a way that seemed alien to men who had left behind German cities pocked with craters and skeletal ruins. Processing happened with American efficiency, a quality that would become familiar in the months ahead. Medical examinations revealed what the prisoners had tried not to think about, that years of war had taken their toll. Doctors with clean instruments and patient manners measured and weighed and recorded. The average prisoner weighed 25 to 30 pounds less than he should have, his body depleted by insufficient rations and the stress of combat. Many showed signs of malnutrition that doctors catalogued with clinical precision. Night blindness from vitamin deficiencies, bleeding gums, skin rashes from pellagra, weakness from beriberi. 1 in 5 prisoners displayed symptoms severe enough to require immediate dietary intervention. The irony bit deep. The master race, the supposed genetic elite, arrived on American soil as specimens of chronic hunger, their bodies testifying to years of inadequate food, even while their leaders had promised strength through proper Aryan vitality. Then came the meals, and with them the first real cracks in the edifice of belief. In mess halls that smelled of coffee and bacon, prisoners lined up with metal trays and watched in disbelief as servers heaped portions onto their plates. Scrambled eggs, yellow and steaming. Fried potatoes seasoned with pepper. Strips of bacon, crisp and fatty. Toast with butter and jam. Coffee, real coffee made from beans, not the roasted grain substitutes that had become standard at home. The quantities seemed wasteful, extravagant, impossible to sustain. Surely this was a show, a propaganda exercise to be photographed and used in leaflets. But the cameras never came. The food simply continued, meal after meal, day after day, generous and routine. Within weeks, the medical reports showed the impact. Average weight gains of 10 to 12 pounds. Improvements in vision, in energy, in overall health. Prisoners found themselves laughing as they ate, then falling silent, confused by the generosity that seemed to have no explanation. The trains that carried them inland opened up vistas that challenged everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Passenger cars with barred windows, yes, but windows nonetheless that let in the scenery of a country untouched by war. The Shenandoah Valley rolled past in shades of green that seemed almost unreal. Orchards heavy with fruit, fields of corn standing tall in neat rows, barns painted red with white trim looking like illustrations from children's books. Towns appeared and disappeared, each one intact, each one showing signs of prosperity that seemed casual, assumed, built into the fabric of daily life. Children waved at the passing trains. Sometimes they ran alongside, tossing packages through the bars, chewing gum or chocolate or hard candy, small gifts that carried enormous weight. A corporal from Cologne caught a chocolate bar thrown by a girl who could not have been more than 10 years old. He turned it over in his hands, studying the wrapper, feeling its weight. He had not seen chocolate in 3 years. The girl had given away 2 bars as if they meant nothing. The landscape itself became a lesson in scale and plenty. Mile after mile of farmland, stretching beyond the horizon, cattle grazing in pastures behind fences that looked sturdy and well-maintained, irrigation systems that spoke of investment in agriculture, of a society that planned for abundance rather than just survival. The prisoners counted what they saw from the windows, trying to make sense of the numbers. Grain elevators the size of cathedrals. Freight trains so long they took minutes to pass. Highways where cars moved in steady streams, burning gasoline that apparently existed in unlimited supply. To men from a country where fuel had been rationed since the war began, where vehicles sat idle for lack of petrol, the casual consumption seemed almost obscene. A private from Stuttgart watched a farmer drive a tractor across a field and wrote in his journal that evening about the impossibility of it all, how back home such machinery sat rusting in barns because there was no fuel to run it. Yet here in America, even the enemy's prisoners rode in vehicles that consumed fuel without apparent concern. By late summer of 1943, many of these trains converged on Texas, where the government had thrown up prison camps with remarkable speed. Camp Swift rose near Bastrop in a matter of months, thousands of acres transformed into a functioning facility, complete with barracks, guard towers, kitchens, workshops, even a hospital with modern equipment and trained staff. The camp could house 5,000 prisoners, and by autumn it did. Germans from various branches of the military, young men mostly, veterans of North Africa who carried with them the strange dual consciousness of defeat and relief. Defeat because they had lost, their units shattered, their grand vision of victory revealed as fantasy. Relief because they had survived, and survival in this particular captivity seemed to promise something beyond mere existence. The physical conditions of the camp struck them immediately. Electric lights that worked reliably, not the flickering or non-existent power they had known in the field. Hot water that flowed from taps, a luxury almost beyond comprehension for men used to cold creek water or none at all. Flush toilets that actually flushed, not the crude latrine trenches of military life. Each barracks had heating for winter, ventilation for summer, and beds with actual mattresses stuffed with cotton. The guards carried weapons, but used them primarily for show. They spoke to prisoners in casual tones, sometimes joking, often sharing cigarettes or small talk about baseball scores or news from home. The whole atmosphere felt wrong, felt too easy, felt like a trap that would snap shut eventually. But the trap never closed. The ease, it turned out, was simply how things were. Meals in the camp mess halls followed U.S. Army standards, which meant the prisoners ate nearly as well as American soldiers. 3 hot meals a day, every day, with portions calculated to provide around 3,500 calories. Breakfasts of eggs and bacon and coffee, lunches of soup and sandwiches and fruit, dinners of roasted meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, sometimes pie for dessert. Peanut butter appeared in jars on tables. That strange American invention that initially repulsed some prisoners with its sticky sweetness, then became an obsession they could not explain. One sergeant from Bavaria spent a full paragraph of his diary trying to describe the taste and texture of peanut butter, concluding that it was somehow both disgusting and addictive, and that he had eaten an entire jar over the course of 3 days. The guards had laughed at him, but not meanly, just the casual mockery of people who had grown up with something and found it amusing that others found it strange. Under Geneva Convention rules, prisoners who worked received payment, not much, but enough to use at camp canteens. With their scrip or tokens, men could buy cigarettes, candy bars, toiletries, writing paper, magazines, and most remarkably, bottles of Coca-Cola served cold over ice. The canteen became a social center, a place where prisoners gathered in the evenings to make purchases and sit talking, drinking their cokes, listening to radios that played American music, sometimes trying to follow baseball games even though the rules made no sense to them. A sergeant who had been a schoolteacher in Munich before the war described sitting in the shade outside the canteen, sipping a Coca-Cola, listening to Glenn Miller on the radio, and thinking that surely this could not be imprisonment, that surely there had been some mistake and he had accidentally been admitted to a resort instead of a prison camp. The numbers continued to astonish as they learned more about American production. The guards spoke casually of rationing at home, of families making do with less butter or sugar, but even these reduced rations exceeded what German civilians had seen in years. An American soldier might complain about having to accept margarine instead of butter, but he still had bread to put it on, and coffee to drink with breakfast, and meat several times a week. German civilians, by contrast, queued for hours to receive rations that might include a few ounces of questionable sausage, bread made partly from sawdust, coffee substitute made from roasted acorns. The disparity became a source of guilt and confusion. Letters from home painted pictures of privation, while letters from the prisoners described 3 meals a day and trips to the canteen for luxuries. Families could not understand. Some accused their imprisoned sons and husbands of lying, of exaggerating, because surely the enemy would not feed prisoners better than the fatherland fed its own people. Entertainment and education filled the hours when prisoners were not working. Camp libraries stocked books in German and English, everything from technical manuals to novels to philosophy. Film nights showed Hollywood movies, carefully selected to avoid controversial content, but still offering glimpses of American life that fascinated the viewers. Westerns proved especially popular, their simple stories of frontier justice and individual heroism translating across cultural barriers. Musical performances happened regularly, sometimes by visiting groups, sometimes by prisoners themselves who formed orchestras and choruses. Men who had been musicians before the war found or made instruments and began playing concerts that drew crowds of both prisoners and guards. The camp administration even supplied materials for art classes, for theatrical productions, for educational lectures on everything from English grammar to American history. The sense of being in a university as much as a prison camp crept over many of them, a feeling that they were not just being held, but somehow being taught, shown things, exposed to ideas and ways of living that challenged their previous certainties. Physical recreation took on an importance that went beyond simple exercise. Soccer matches drew crowds of cheering prisoners, teams forming based on regions or branches of service, rivalries developing that were fierce but ultimately harmless. Guards sometimes watched from the towers, occasionally placing small bets on the outcomes. Gardens appeared in patches of ground near the barracks, prisoners cultivating vegetables and flowers with seeds provided by the camp administration or smuggled in by sympathetic locals. The act of making something grow, of tending plants and watching them flourish, provided a connection to normal life that many had not realized they missed. One man from a farming village in Bavaria spent every free hour in the garden, his hands in the soil, and wrote to his wife that he felt almost at peace despite the wire and the guns and the knowledge that he was thousands of miles from home in the hands of enemies. July 4th, 1944, arrived with heat and ceremony that the prisoners observed with mixed feelings. American guards spoke of it as Independence Day, a celebration of freedom and national identity. For Germans trained to mock democracy as weak and chaotic, the holiday should have been meaningless, perhaps even contemptible. Instead, what unfolded that afternoon became one of those moments that reshaped understanding at a level deeper than ideology could reach. The smell came first, drifting across the compound as prisoners emerged from barracks to see what the commotion was about. Smoke, not the acrid smoke of battle, but the sweet smoke of cooking, of hickory and mesquite, burning slow and steady. Pits had been dug in open ground beyond one section of wire, and over these pits hung massive slabs of beef brisket, each one weighing 12 to 15 pounds, the meat glistening with seasoning and dripping fat that hissed when it hit the coals below. Texas ranchers had arrived with their equipment and their expertise, men in worn boots and wide hats who treated the cooking with the seriousness of a military operation. They tended the fires, adjusted the meat, basted and turned and tested with the confidence of people who had done this 1,000 times. Buck Morrison, a rancher whose spread covered thousands of acres northwest of the camp, lifted the lid off a steel smoker and pulled out a brisket that had been cooking for 12 hours. The bark on the outside was crisp and black, the smoke ring just beneath glowed pink, and when he sliced into it, the interior was tender enough to pull apart with fingers. He held up a piece toward the prisoners, watching from their side of the wire, and grinned, calling out that this was how free men eat, that this was Texas hospitality, that even enemies could share a meal on Independence Day. Tables appeared, covered with checkered cloths and loaded with sides that seemed to multiply beyond reason. Cornbread, golden and crumbling, slathered with butter. Baked beans, slow-cooked with molasses until they were thick and sweet. Potato salad with hard-boiled eggs and pickles. Coleslaw dressed with vinegar that cut through the richness of the meat. Biscuits light enough to float. Jars of pickles, both sweet and dill, fresh tomatoes sliced thick, watermelon, the flesh pink and cold and impossibly sweet, peach cobbler with crusts that shattered at the touch of a fork, and everywhere bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in the heat, the drinks free for anyone who wanted one, as many as they could drink. American families from Bastrop and the surrounding area had come out for the celebration, parents and children mixing with soldiers and, at a careful distance, watching the prisoners who watched them. The invitation to eat came as a shock. Guards opened a gate and gestured for prisoners to come forward, not all at once but in groups, supervised but not threatened. Plates were loaded with portions that seemed criminally generous. A man might receive a pound of brisket, tender slices stacked high, along with helpings of every side dish, bread, cobbler, and a Coke to wash it down. The first prisoners approached hesitantly, expecting a trick or a test. Instead, they found American families serving food with genuine smiles, teenagers handing over Cokes, children staring with open curiosity, but without fear or hatred. A teenage girl, perhaps 16, slipped an extra slice of cobbler onto a sergeant's plate and told him, in halting German, that her grandmother had been from Hamburg. The sergeant, whose own family in Hamburg had written of near starvation, stood holding the plate and felt tears he could not explain. The taste overwhelmed everything. Brisket that had been smoking for half a day, the meat so tender it fell apart, the flavor deep and complex from the smoke and spices, fat rendered down into juices that soaked into the bread and mixed with the sweetness of beans and the sharp tang of coleslaw. Cornbread that was somehow both savory and sweet, the texture perfect, nothing like the dense black bread they had known in Germany. Coca-Cola so cold it hurt teeth, the bubbles sharp and the sweetness almost medicinal in its intensity. Cobbler with fruit that tasted like summer condensed into sugar and butter and pastry. The sensory assault left men sitting in the shade, plates empty, stomachs full to the point of discomfort, minds racing to reconcile what they had just experienced with everything they thought they knew about America. Musicians appeared as the afternoon wore on, a band of locals with fiddles and guitars and a bass that thumped out rhythms unfamiliar to German ears. Country music, they called it. Simple melodies and straightforward lyrics about love and loss and wide-open spaces. Some prisoners clapped along, self-conscious but unable to resist. Others sat silent, listening, watching American families dance on the grass, children running and playing, the whole scene radiating a casual normalcy that seemed impossible in the middle of a war. Fireworks came at dusk, not the artillery the prisoners knew, but decorative explosions that painted the sky in colors and patterns, each burst followed by cheers and applause. The irony was not lost on anyone. They were captives watching their captors celebrate freedom, and yet the food in their bellies and the kindness they had been shown made the celebration feel inclusive rather than mocking. That night, lying in their bunks, with the smell of smoke still in their clothes and the taste of barbecue lingering, many prisoners found sleep difficult. Stomachs unaccustomed to such rich food protested. But more than physical discomfort, there was mental disturbance, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Dr. Wilhelm Huffman, a physician who had been captured in Tunisia and now worked in the camp hospital, wrote a long entry in his journal trying to make sense of the day. He described the quantities of meat, the waste he had seen, scraps of brisket thrown away that would have fed a family in Germany for days. He described the casual generosity of the Americans, the way they had included enemies in their celebration without apparent fear or hesitation. Most of all, he described his own confusion, his inability to square this experience with years of training and propaganda that had insisted America was weak, corrupt, decadent, on the verge of collapse. If this was decadence, he wrote, then perhaps strength had been redefined in ways the Reich had never understood. Daily life in the camps continued this pattern of small shocks and contradictions. Breakfast arrived every morning with the regularity of sunrise. Eggs prepared in whatever style the cooks felt like making. Oatmeal or grits, those strange American porridges that took getting used to. Toast or biscuits or pancakes, all with butter and jam or syrup. Bacon or sausage. Coffee, always coffee, hot and strong and plentiful. The prisoners ate and gained weight and felt guilty about it. Letters from home spoke of children fainting in school from hunger, of elderly parents growing thin, of rations cut again and again until families survived on soup made from potato peels and whatever scraps could be found. Yet here they sat, prisoners of war, eating better than their families, eating better than they had eaten as free soldiers in the Wehrmacht, eating well enough that their clothes no longer fit properly and new uniforms had to be issued in larger sizes. Work details took prisoners out of the camps and into American communities, another source of profound disorientation. Under guard, but not shackled, they rode trucks into towns and onto farms, hired out as labor to help with harvests or construction or whatever needed doing. The pay was minimal, but the experiences were priceless. They walked through American streets and saw shops with full windows, markets with produce stacked high, gas stations where cars pulled in constantly to fill tanks. They worked alongside American farmers and learned that these were not the poverty-stricken peasants of propaganda, but landowners with tractors and combines, with refrigerators in their kitchens and radios in their living rooms, with children who went to school and wives who drove cars into town for groceries. The cognitive dissonance became almost unbearable. A prisoner from Hamburg, working at a sawmill in Oregon, watched the foreman throw away his lunch leftovers, half a sandwich and an apple with one bite taken from it. The German retrieved them from the trash when no one was looking and ate them that night in his bunk, not from hunger, but from an inability to accept such waste. Kindness appeared in unexpected places and ways. A Minnesota farm wife saw prisoners working in her fields and brought out lemonade on a hot afternoon, cold and sweet, and served in real glasses. She spoke no German, and they spoke almost no English, but the act of hospitality needed no translation. A shopkeeper in Kansas let prisoners browse his store while their guards waited outside, trusting them not to steal, treating them like customers rather than enemies. A church group in Nebraska organized a Christmas party at the local camp and brought gifts, small things like gloves or socks, but the gesture carried weight far beyond the value of the items. Children in town after town waved at passing trucks full of prisoners, innocently friendly, seeing not Germans or enemies, but simply men far from home. These small moments of human connection eroded certainty more effectively than any propaganda could have built it. The contrast with home intensified as the war ground toward its conclusion. By late 1944, letters from Germany painted increasingly desperate pictures. Cities lay in ruins from bombing campaigns that came day and night without respite. Rations had been cut so severely that malnutrition became the norm rather than the exception. Fuel shortages meant people froze in winter. Medical supplies ran out. Even basic necessities like soap or matches became luxuries. Meanwhile, prisoners in America continued their strange existence of abundance behind wire. They had soap, medicine, clothing, food, entertainment, even small luxuries. The guilt gnawed at many of them. They wrote letters trying to explain, trying to describe what they were experiencing, but the words seemed inadequate or unbelievable. Some stopped writing about the food altogether, unable to tell their starving families about the meals they were eating. Others tried to send packages back, but found the regulations too restrictive or the addresses bombed into non-existence. The psychological impact of extended exposure to American prosperity cannot be overstated. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the prisoners lived inside a functioning democracy, watching it work, participating in its daily rhythms. They saw that Americans complained about rationing, but still had more than enough. They saw that elections happened even during wartime, that people criticized their government openly without being arrested, that newspapers printed dissenting opinions without being shut down. They saw inefficiency and waste, yes, but also flexibility and innovation, a system that could make mistakes and correct them, that could absorb criticism and adapt. Most powerful of all, they saw ordinary people living ordinary lives with a degree of comfort and security that seemed almost utopian compared to what they had known. Not perfect lives, not lives without struggle or sorrow, but lives with enough food and shelter and safety that people could think about happiness rather than just survival. Some prisoners resisted these lessons, clinging to ideology even in the face of contrary evidence. They formed groups within the camps, Nazi cells that enforced old hierarchies and punished anyone who showed too much friendliness toward the Americans. These true believers, often officers or party members, maintained that the abundance was fake, that America would collapse any day, that final victory remained inevitable despite all appearances to the contrary. But even among the hardliners, doubt crept in. How long could a fake be maintained? How deep did the deception run? And if it was all real, if America genuinely had this much wealth and power, what did that say about the Führer's promise of victory, about the fundamental assumptions that had driven the war? The questions had no good answers, so many chose not to ask them. But the questions remained nonetheless, gnawing at certainty in quiet moments. By 1945, as news of Germany's situation grew more dire, the camps took on an increasingly surreal quality. Outside the wire, America prepared for victory with a confidence that seemed entirely justified. Inside the wire, men who had marched to war expecting to conquer Europe instead found themselves well-fed spectators to their nation's collapse. VE Day came in May, and with it, the knowledge that soon they would be going home. Relief mixed with dread. They had survived, yes, but what were they returning to? The reports from occupied Germany spoke of devastation beyond imagining, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced, starvation widespread. The occupation authorities were struggling to provide even minimal rations, often falling below 1,000 calories per day. Children begged for food, women traded family heirlooms for bread. The black market thrived because the official economy had essentially ceased to exist. Reading these reports while sitting in an American camp with 3 meals a day felt obscene, felt like a betrayal, felt like being trapped in a parallel world that bore no relation to reality. The repatriation began in late 1945 and continued into 1946. Trainloads of prisoners heading back to ports, boarding liberty ships for the return voyage. This time, they knew what awaited them. The ships felt different on the return journey, quieter, more somber. Men stood on deck and watched the American coastline recede, knowing they might never see it again, knowing that what they had experienced here would be almost impossible to explain to those who had not seen it. Some carried photographs, small souvenirs, addresses of Americans who had shown them kindness. Others carried only memories, but those memories were vivid and troubling. How do you tell your family that while they starved, you were eating steak? How do you explain that the enemy treated you better than your own government had? How do you reconcile gratitude toward your captors with loyalty to your homeland? Arrival in Germany shocked even those who thought they were prepared. The ports were damaged, only partially functional. Cities inland were worse, street after street of ruins, buildings reduced to shells, people living in basements or makeshift shelters. The refugees and displaced persons clogged every road, families carrying what little they had salvaged, searching for relatives or places that no longer existed. Food queues stretched for blocks, people waiting hours for rations that would not fill a hungry child for a day. The contrast with America hit like a physical blow. A former prisoner from Camp Swift, returning to Munich, walked through his old neighborhood and could not find his street. The entire area had been bombed flat, landmarks obliterated, nothing remaining but rubble and the shells of a few walls. He eventually found his family living in the basement of a partially destroyed building, sharing the space with 2 other families. His mother wept when she saw him, not just from relief that he had survived, but from something harder to define. Perhaps the knowledge that her son had been eating well while she had been starving, perhaps anger at the injustice of it, perhaps simple exhaustion from years of suffering. He tried to describe America to her that night, the camps, the food, the kindness, but the words felt hollow. She listened and nodded and clearly did not believe him, or chose not to believe him, because the truth would be too painful to accept. Reintegration proved difficult for many returnees. They brought back stories that sounded like fantasies to people who had never left Germany, tales of abundance so extreme it seemed like propaganda. Some were accused of lying, of having been brainwashed by American captors, of betraying their nation by speaking well of the enemy. Others kept quiet, learning that their experiences created more problems than understanding. But among themselves, in quiet conversations in ruins or refugee camps, they shared what they had seen and tried to make sense of it. They had witnessed firsthand the gap between propaganda and reality, between what they had been told about America and what America actually was. That knowledge could not be erased or ignored. It shaped their views of democracy, of capitalism, of individual freedom, of what a society could achieve when it organized itself around production and prosperity rather than conquest and control. Historians examining this period have noted the long-term impact of the POW experience on German society. Hundreds of thousands of men returned from American captivity with direct knowledge of how a democracy functioned, how a market economy operated, how a free society organized itself. They became part of the generation that rebuilt West Germany, and many of them brought with them lessons learned in camps like Swift or Alva or Concordia. Not all, certainly. Some remained committed Nazis, or became communists, or simply tried to forget everything and move on with their lives. But enough were influenced that the effect can be traced in the post-war development of German democracy, in the economic miracle of the 1950s, in the gradual embrace of Western values and institutions, the barbecue in Texas, the Coca-Cola in canteens, the basic decency of treatment, all became part of a larger transformation that helped reshape Europe. The food remained the most visceral memory. Decades later, elderly men who had been young prisoners would recall with perfect clarity the first time they bit into American white bread, the shock of how soft it was, how sweet. They remembered the coffee, real coffee, hot and bitter and unlimited. They remembered milk, whole milk, cold and creamy. They remembered portions so large they could not finish them, and the guilt of wasting food when they knew people were starving back home. They remembered specific meals, a Thanksgiving dinner with turkey and stuffing, a 4th of July barbecue with brisket, a Christmas breakfast with ham and eggs, all served to prisoners of war while their fellow Germans fought and died and starved. The food became shorthand for everything America represented: the abundance, the confidence, the casual assumption that there would always be enough, that waste was not a crime, but simply an inefficiency to be minimized, rather than a sin to be punished. The economic lesson proved perhaps the most durable. Germany had organized itself around autarky and conquest, believing that living space and resources could be seized by force and that self-sufficiency was the highest goal. America had organized itself around trade and production, believing that wealth could be created through labor and innovation, and that prosperity came from exchange rather than plunder. The results spoke for themselves. Germany, for all its military prowess and industrial capacity, had struggled to feed its people even before the war, and during the war rations had steadily declined until hunger became universal. America, fighting on two fronts and supplying allies around the world, had maintained civilian living standards that Germany could not match even in peacetime. The prisoners saw this with their own eyes, lived it in their own bodies, felt their strength return as they gained weight on American rations. The lesson could not be unlearned. Whatever the merits of National Socialism as an ideology, as an economic system, it had demonstrably failed when measured against democratic capitalism. The human dimension transcended economics or politics. The prisoners had been prepared to hate, had been trained to see Americans as racial inferiors, as mongrels and degenerates. Instead, they had met farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and factory workers, guards and administrators who treated them with basic decency. Not everyone, certainly. There were bigots and bullies among the Americans, as among any people. But the overall experience was one of humanity rather than ideology, of individuals interacting as individuals rather than as representatives of races or nations. A prisoner from Cologne remembered a Kansas wheat farmer who hired him for the harvest and who treated him exactly like any other worker, showing him what to do, offering water when he was thirsty, sitting with him at lunch and trying to talk, despite the language barrier. At the end of the season, the farmer paid him his wages and shook his hand and said he hoped the man would make it home safely to his family. Such simple human gestures carried enormous weight for men who had been taught that such gestures across enemy lines were impossible, that war reduced everything to kill or be killed, conquer or be conquered. Children played an especially powerful role in breaking down barriers. In towns near camps, children were often the first to approach prisoners, innocent of propaganda, curious rather than fearful. They asked questions, showed off toys, shared snacks, treated the Germans like exotic visitors rather than dangerous enemies. A prisoner working on a farm in Iowa befriended the farmer's 8-year-old son, who followed him around asking endless questions about Germany and airplanes and whether he had ever met a real general. The boy gave him a baseball card and tried to explain the rules of the game. Decades later, the Germans still had that card, creased and faded, a tangible memory of innocence bridging the chasm of war. Such interactions reminded the prisoners that they were fighting not against monsters but against people, and that people on both sides had families and hopes and simple human needs that transcended national allegiance. Women, too, complicated the narrative of enmity, whether farm wives offering lemonade, church ladies organizing care packages, teenage girls flirting carefully with prisoners on work details, or mothers whose sons were fighting overseas but who still showed compassion to enemy prisoners. Women often demonstrated a humanity that cut through military logic. A German prisoner working in a canning factory in Minnesota recalled the plant manager, a widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal. She had every reason to hate Germans, to take revenge however small. Instead, she managed the prisoner labor detail with fairness and occasional kindness, making sure they got their breaks, checking that they had winter coats when the weather turned cold. When asked why, she simply said that hatred would not bring her husband back, and that someone had to choose to stop hating or the war would never really end. Such moments of grace, small and individual, but cumulative in their impact, reshaped understanding at a level deeper than politics or ideology could reach. Music and art provided another bridge across the divide. German prisoners, who had been musicians before the war, formed orchestras and bands in the camps, playing everything from classical symphonies to popular dance music. Americans came to concerts and applauded, appreciating the skill even when it came from enemy hands. A violinist from Vienna gave recitals that drew audiences from nearby towns, people who sat in camp meeting halls and listened to Brahms and Beethoven performed by a man in prisoner garb. After one concert, an elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes and said his playing reminded her of her childhood, when her German immigrant parents had taken her to concerts in Chicago. The shared language of music transcended the temporary circumstances of captivity and enmity, reminding everyone that culture and beauty could survive even war. Religion, too, offered common ground. Catholic prisoners attended Mass with local congregations, sitting in the back, but participating in the same rituals, receiving the same communion. Protestant prisoners joined services where language barriers faded in the familiarity of hymns and prayers. Jewish prisoners, the few who had somehow survived in the Wehrmacht by hiding their identity, found themselves in a country where synagogues stood unmolested and Jewish families lived openly. The contrast with the horrors being perpetrated back in Europe could not have been sharper. A prisoner from Berlin, who had kept his Jewish ancestry secret through years of military service, wrote in his diary about attending services at a synagogue in New York while on a work detail. He described weeping uncontrollably, unable to reconcile the normalcy he was witnessing with the knowledge of what was happening to Jews in the camps back home. The experience, he wrote, convinced him that after the war he would emigrate if possible, that he could never return to a Germany that had done what it had done. The education that happened in the camps, both formal and informal, also contributed to transformation. English classes taught more than vocabulary. They taught American idioms and concepts, ways of thinking that differed fundamentally from German patterns. Civics classes explained American government, the separation of powers, the role of elections, the concept of constitutional rights. For men raised under authoritarian rule, these ideas initially seemed chaotic and inefficient. How could anything get done if power was so dispersed? How could a nation function if people could freely criticize their leaders? But watching the system work, seeing decisions made and implemented despite the apparent chaos, gradually shifted perspectives. A prisoner from Frankfurt, who took detailed notes during civics classes, later returned to Germany and became active in politics, helping to draft local governance structures based partly on what he had learned. The multiplier effect of such individual transformations, repeated across hundreds of thousands of returnees, contributed to the democratic rebuilding of West Germany. Sports provided yet another arena for bridging differences. Soccer matches between prisoner teams and American military teams became popular entertainment, drawing crowds from both sides of the wire. The competition was genuine. Both sides wanted to win, but it was bounded by rules and ultimately meaningless beyond pride. A fierce match would end with handshakes and backslapping, enemies for 90 minutes, then humans again. Baseball, that most American of games, fascinated some prisoners who tried to learn it, despite its complexity. A camp in Wisconsin organized a baseball league with prisoner teams, and by the end of the summer, they were playing reasonably competent ball, cheering and arguing and celebrating just like any American team. The absurdity of German POWs playing America's national pastime did not escape anyone, but it was a productive absurdity, one that emphasized common humanity over national division. The landscape itself imprinted deeply on the prisoner's consciousness. Men from urban Germany or from the bombed-out cities found the American countryside almost mythically beautiful, untouched and prosperous. A prisoner from Hamburg, whose city had been firebombed into near oblivion, worked on a farm in Pennsylvania and described in letters to his family the rolling green hills, the forests full of deer, the streams where fish actually swam. He planted a vegetable garden and watched it grow through the summer, harvesting tomatoes and beans and squash, simple acts that reconnected him to a peaceful existence he had almost forgotten was possible. When the war ended and repatriation loomed, he wrote that part of him wanted to stay, wanted to remain in this green, peaceful land, rather than return to the grey ruins of his homeland. He did return, duty-bound, but the memory of Pennsylvania stayed with him, a touchstone of what life could be. The waste troubled them and fascinated them in equal measure. Americans threw away food that Germans would have treasured. Crusts of bread, potato peels, bacon grease, bones with meat still on them, all tossed casually into garbage bins. Prisoners working kitchen duty saw this waste daily and at first salvaged what they could, compulsively unable to let good food be destroyed. Eventually, they learned that the supply was truly endless, that tomorrow would bring more, that hoarding was unnecessary. But the psychological adjustment was difficult. A man raised to save every scrap, to use and reuse until nothing remained, could not easily adopt the casual wastefulness of abundance. Yet that wastefulness was itself a form of wealth, the luxury of having so much that economy at the margins became pointless, that efficiency could be sacrificed for convenience without real loss. Understanding this required a fundamental reorientation of values and assumptions. Technology amazed them at every turn. Tractors and combines that could do the work of dozens of men, refrigerators that kept food fresh indefinitely, washing machines that cleaned clothes with the push of a button, radios in every home, telephones that connected houses to each other and to the wider world, automobiles so common that working families owned them. The mechanization of American life, the casual integration of labor-saving devices into daily routine, demonstrated a level of industrial development that Germany had aspired to but never achieved. The prisoners had grown up hearing that German engineering was the world's finest, that German industry led the world. Working in American factories and farms, they saw that this was propaganda. American industry operated on a scale and with an efficiency that German planners had only dreamed of. The lesson stung national pride, but could not be denied. The kindness that followed defeat proved more difficult to process than the cruelty they had expected. Punishment they could have understood and endured. Generosity confused them, forced them to confront questions about propaganda, about their leaders, about the war itself. If America was as evil and weak as they had been told, why this treatment? If democracy was truly inferior to authoritarian strength, why had the democracies won? These questions had no comfortable answers. Some prisoners retreated into bitterness, convincing themselves that the kindness was weakness and that given time Germany would have prevailed. Others began the painful process of acknowledging that they had been lied to, that their sacrifices had been in service of lies, that the war had been based on fundamental misconceptions about the world. This latter group faced a difficult psychological journey, but emerged from it changed in ways that would influence the rest of their lives. By the time repatriation was complete, nearly 500,000 German prisoners had spent time in the United States, experiencing American life from behind wire, but still experiencing it firsthand. They had eaten American food, learned American songs, worked alongside American civilians, observed American democracy in action. They had seen prosperity and waste, efficiency and chaos, kindness and prejudice, all mixed together in the complicated reality of a nation that defied simple categorization. Most importantly, they had learned that the enemy was not what propaganda had painted, that Americans were not subhuman or weak, but simply people organized differently, with different values and different systems, and that those differences had proven decisive in war. Taking that knowledge back to Germany, carrying it through the difficult years of occupation and reconstruction, sharing it in conversations and decisions large and small, they became unwitting agents of transformation, helping to reshape German society in ways that would have been impossible if they had never left the ruins of Europe. The summer barbecue at Camp Swift became, in memory, a symbol of everything they had experienced. The smoke and the meat, the generosity and the abundance, the children with ice cream and the families celebrating freedom while their enemies watched from behind wire. That image, burned into memory by shock and incomprehension, carried forward through decades, a reminder that war could be fought between civilizations that shared more than they differed, that enemies could become friends, that abundance was more powerful than ideology, and that sometimes the most effective weapon was not a bomb or a bullet, but simply showing people a better way to live. The prisoners had come expecting chains and found Coca-Cola. They had expected hatred and found, if not friendship, at least decency. They had expected punishment and found, improbably, a glimpse of prosperity that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the end, America defeated Germany twice, once with armies and once with abundance, and of the two, the latter proved more enduring.